say yes to no debt. 12 steps to
Right.
financial freedom. Now, you in your
Right.
opening, you talk about how debt is the new slavery. Can you talk a little
Right.
bit about that?
Yeah. And when I say new, I'm not talking about new from an historical perspective. I'm talking about new from an African American perspective. When we came out of slavery, many slaves stayed around the plantations and they did what we call sharecropping. And sharecropping was a form of freedom, but actually it was a greater form of debt, which was essentially slavery. A sharecropper, and we hear all the time, older black people say, well, my father was a sharecropper. Sharecropper was when a landowner provided you, they gave you land, they gave you seeds, tools, clothing, food, and they would charge you for these supplies, but they would take your profits out of the harvest. And when there was an inadequate harvest or a low harvest, you would end up owing for plant, for seeds, for housing. And many black people who were sharecroppers never got out of debt. They owed the landlord, which meant that although slavery was over, the economics of sharecropping was such that they couldn't leave. So a slave is someone whose life and whose assets are under the control of someone else to the benefit of that someone else. And when we were in chattel slavery, we worked, and our work went to the benefit of the slave owner and not to us ourselves. Well, when we're in debt, when I am paying Citibank 14 cents on the dollar on average to use their card to buy my TV, I can't tell Citibank, well, I'm not paying you the 14 cents. I can't tell Citibank that if I don't pay them what I owe on my credit card that they can't come after me. And most of us have never read the small print on our credit card agreement. We're just so happy to have the card. But those credit card agreements give the credit card owner the right to come after you for whatever they want. And if you don't pay your credit card bill, you pay late interest, you pay late fees, and they can come after you for thousands of dollars more than you owed in the first place. So we start by asking people to take control of our finances, starting with debt. Because if you're drowning in debt, you're not going to invest. You're not going to buy the block. You're not going to be approved for a mortgage to buy an asset that grows in value. If you're drowning in debt, you're not going to own and become financially free. So getting out of debt is the first step towards financial freedom.
So why do you care? You know, you're a pastor. You preach. You save souls. You win souls. What's your personal attachment to debt and your personal story to being in bondage to it?
I got my first credit card at 18. I thought it was a gift. I went from buying $1 worth of gas every week at the gas station up the street from my house to filling up my tank so I could drive to the parties and drive around and wave at the girls. You know, so my expenditure on gasoline at 18 years old with no full-time job went from $4 a month to $200 a month in 1 month. That was when I was 18 because my parents didn't have credit cards. My grandparents didn't have credit cards, and I thought the credit card was like real money. And so from the time I was 18 until the time I was 31, I got deeper and deeper and deeper in debt. I made $25,000 a year working for Jesse Jackson. I had a $5,000 credit card limit, so I lived as if I made $30,000. And I was paying credit cards with credit cards. I was being called by bill collectors. It got to a point where I couldn't even pay the minimum payment on the credit card. So I stopped opening my mail. I knew they weren't asking me, to go out to dinner. So when they sent me a letter, I stopped opening the mail. And when I stopped opening the mail, they had bill collectors call me. Can you imagine being the pastor of a church and every Tuesday after prayer meeting, you go home to talk to a bill collector? To be a civil rights leader, I was leading marches and rallies in my 20s. And I'd come home from my protest meetings to be called by a bill collector. I was pastoring a small church and could not tithe to my own church. When my father died at 47 years old, my mother was 44, I was broke. I had no savings, had no insurance. If my father had no insurance, my mother would have been homeless. And so I was living this way. And on the outside, I looked like an upstanding young leader on the rise. But the reality was I couldn't even write a check to the NAACP, to the United Negro College Fund. And in fact, when I look around, had it not been for generous white people, there'd be no NAACP. That many of our black colleges wouldn't exist if it were not for white philanthropy. And so I decided that I had to stop living the lie. I was living a lie, Karen. I was dressed up, nice clothes. I was in the newspapers. Gil Noble you remember Gil Noble?
Like
Gil
it
Noble
is.
used to have me on this TV show, Like It Is. And, I was signing autographs, running with Jesse Jackson, and absolutely broke. And when I lived that way for 13 years, and my black grandmother from Brooklyn died when I was 31 years old. And when she died, she left me my first piece of real estate. She owned 3 houses. All 3 houses were paid for. She had 6 children. She had a husband who couldn't work because he had a stroke. She was a seamstress, but she had a house in upstate New York. She had a brownstone in Brooklyn. She had a 4-family in Bed-Stuy, and she left me half of that 4-family, and that's how I got my start. And so I said at my grandmother's grave, I said, if my black grandmother with no civil rights, no Congressional Black Caucus, no husband to support her, if she can die and leave me a house paid for, shame on me if when I die, all I have to leave is credit card bills. And I decided that day to change my life. And that's why I care, because I see people today making $100,000 a year living paycheck to paycheck. I mean, forget about right now the issue of poverty and the issue of bad policy and those issues, which were systemic racism that was responsible for redlining and leaving us out of the FHA and the VA. There are black people who have been blessed. They've got education. They're living in the suburbs. They've got 2-car garages, and they are broke because they are equating their significance with their stuff. And if they are 2 paychecks away from not having a job, they're 2 paychecks away from being homeless. A lot of good-looking, middle-class, upstanding, nice car driving black folks are very fragile financially. So that's why I care. I've got a whole church full of them.
We're talking with Dr. Reverend DeForest. Soaries, DB Soaries is where you can follow him, like Soar, I-E-S, Soaries. There's this thing called, not a thing, it's a kind of guy in Africa called a dandy. And we have dandies here, and what you're describing are dandies. These are people who dress to the nines but don't have a pot to piss in or a window to throw it out of. But I think people who have been oppressed or in bondage or colonized and don't have too much to lean on, that outward, expression of wealth, it's the phenomenon of driving a luxury car into the projects or making sure the babies have the latest shoes, the latest Nikes, the latest Jordans, even though they're going to grow out of them while you're living in the projects. And I have a hard time now. I used to judge it a lot when I was younger, but when you don't feel value and everything around you tells you you're not, this is the one thing that no one could take from you. And so people will spin themselves into debt to feel like they matter, to feel like they're worthy.
That's exactly right. That's why in the book, early on, I talk about 3 types of spending, all of which foster debt. And the first is compensatory spending, where we're spending to compensate for the lack of affirmation, the lack of respect, the lack of love, and so we're spending really for significance. Now, when we were younger, we heard voices, Malcolm X and Dr. King and Huey Newton and Rap Brown, and they spoke to us to change our mentality. So there was a time when we were happy being Negroes. Elijah Muhammad came along and said, stop calling yourself Negroes. He had a message to the black man. And so in the 60s, we had voices, we had leaders, we had advocates that taught us to change the way we think. And my role today is to help people change the way we think. You can drive a Toyota and be somebody, and you can drive a Mercedes and be a fool. That our identity and our self-worth is not derived from the things that we buy, but it's derived from the things that we know and the things we believe on the inside. And until we change the way we think, we'll never close the wealth gap, because wealth for us will be just a word, and looking good and feeling good and sounding good will become all we attain. We have to change the way we think.
Dr. Soaries, there is, of course, the case to be made about credit card debt and excessive spending, but what about student loan debt? A lot of times we know that the best way to level up in society is through education, and there's one part of being mindful when you're in school and how much loans you are taking out. I can speak from personal experience. I took out probably a little bit more than I should have. But then the other part of it is there is a systemic problem of just the cost of higher education in general.
Right. One of the great vulgarities of our society is the cost of higher education. And it's exacerbated by the fact that the government actually finances high interest loans for its citizens to go to schools that don't prepare them for the jobs that exist. You can go to Rutgers University and get a 4-year liberal arts degree and still not be qualified to take one of those 1.5 million jobs that we need in this country, from nurses, artificial intelligence, robotics. You can take a 19-year-old and go through a 6-month training course, get a certificate, and go get a job making twice as much as the average liberal arts college graduate today. So higher education has to be completely restructured and rethought. Now, we've been telling our church members, Sina, for a long time, go to a community college for the first 2 years. You read the same books. You have the same content. You go to community college, you'll save at least 60% of what it costs to go to a 4-year college, and then transfer, perhaps, and go to a 2-year for 2 years to get your bachelor's. Here's the other thing about the 4-year degree. I have a 4-year degree, so I'm telling people, but I didn't graduate in 4 years. And what I've discovered is that 80% of the college students take more than 4 years to graduate. So why don't you set out to take 6 to 8 years to graduate and work part-time and go to school part-time and pay as you go, and avoid this $165,000 worth of debt that a young lady told me she had today. She'll never make $165,000 worth of extra income to pay off debt. So just assume you're in the 80%. You're not going to graduate in 4 years. You'll probably graduate in 6 to 8 years. Get a job somewhere. Take 2 or 3 courses at a time, rather than going full-time, flunking out 2 or 3 times, wasting your parents' money, wasting your student loan money, and then when you're 25, 26, you're mature enough to take school seriously anyway.